God's calling on your life is bigger than your circumstances. Too often we look at where we are, at what's in front of us, and we start to doubt what God has spoken. Maybe you feel stuck in a job that doesn't inspire you, surrounded by challenges that make you wonder if you'll ever step into your purpose. Maybe you've been praying, believing, and waiting, but nothing seems to be changing. It's easy to look at what's around us and think, maybe I missed it. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe this isn't for me. But let me remind you today, God's calling is not limited by your current situation. His plans for you were set in motion long before you faced this obstacle, long before you felt stuck, and long before you even knew what he had placed inside you. Think about Joseph. When God gave him a dream of leadership, of influence, of greatness, he was just a young boy in his father's house. That dream was real, that calling was set. But Joseph's circumstances didn't look anything like his destiny. His brothers betrayed him, threw him into a pit, and sold him into slavery. Later, he was wrongfully imprisoned, forgotten by those he helped. In the natural, it seemed like he was moving further away from God's calling, but in reality, every step, every setback was positioning him for his purpose. The pit, the prison, the betrayal, the waiting, it was all part of the process. What looked like obstacles were actually stepping stones leading him straight to the palace. Some of you are in a season where you feel like you're in the pit. You feel like the dream God gave you is slipping away. But let me tell you today, just because it's difficult doesn't mean it's not part of the plan. Just because you don't see it yet doesn't mean God isn't working. He is ordering your steps, aligning the right people, preparing the right opportunities, and making sure that when the time is right, you will step into everything he has promised you. God is not limited by your background, your education, or the opinions of others. He's not looking at your bank account, your family history, or the mistakes you've made. When he calls you, he already knows every obstacle you will face. He already sees every detour, every delay, every disappointment, and he still says, I have chosen you. I have called you. I have a purpose for you. That means no mistake is big enough to cancel his plan. No setback is strong enough to override his promise. When God calls you, it is settled, it is established. The only question is, will you trust him? The enemy would love for you to believe that where you are now is where you will always be. He wants you to get discouraged, to give up on your dreams, to believe that your circumstances are too big for God. But the Bible says we walk by faith, not by sight. If you only focus on what you can see, you will always feel limited. You will always feel like you don't have enough, like you're not ready, like you're too far behind. But faith says, even when I don't see it, I believe it. Even when I don't feel it, I trust that God is working. I want to encourage you today. Don't let your current situation talk you out of your calling. Don't let temporary setbacks make you forget the promise. Maybe you've been waiting a long time and it seems like nothing is happening. Maybe you've faced disappointment after disappointment and you're tired. But I declare over your life today, your story is not over. God is still moving. He is still working behind the scenes. And what he started in you, he will bring to completion. You may not see how, you may not know when, but trust this. Your calling is bigger than what you're facing. What's in front of you may look like an obstacle, but in God's hands, it's just part of the process. The closed doors, the delays, the struggles, they are not signs that God has forgotten you. They are signs that he is preparing you. He is strengthening your faith, building your character, and making sure that when the promise comes, you will be ready for it. So don't settle where you are. Don't let frustration or fear cause you to shrink back. Lift your head, straighten your shoulders, and remind yourself, God has called me. He has a purpose for my life. No matter what it looks like, I choose to trust him. When you hold on to that kind of faith, when you refuse to let circumstances shake your confidence in God, you will step into greater favor, greater opportunities, and greater blessings than you ever imagined. Your calling is bigger than your circumstances. Keep believing, keep moving forward, and watch how God turns everything around for your good. Trust requires faith, not full understanding. If you're waiting until you have all the answers, until everything makes perfect sense, you'll never step into what God has for you. God doesn't show us the whole picture at once. He gives us just enough to take the next step. That's where faith comes in. Faith is saying, God, I don't see the way, but I trust you have already made one. I don't know all the details, but I know you do. Too often we want to see the full plan before we move. We pray, God, if you just show me exactly how this will work out, then I'll trust you. If you just give me a sign, then I'll step out. But that's not how faith works. If you could see every step, it wouldn't require trust. If you already knew every detail, you wouldn't need faith. God wants you to walk by faith, not by sight. He wants you to trust him even when you don't understand, even when things seem uncertain, even when you feel unqualified. Look at Abraham. God told him to leave his home, his family, everything familiar, and go to a land that he would show him. Not a land he could see, not a land he could research, but a land that God would show him, meaning Abraham had to start walking before he even knew where he was going. That's faith. That's trust. He didn't have all the details, but he had a word from God, and that was enough. Some of you are in that place right now. You feel like God is calling you to something bigger, something greater, but you don't have all the answers yet. You're waiting for the perfect conditions, for everything to make sense before you move. But if you're waiting for complete clarity, you'll miss your moment. You have to take the first step in faith. You have to be willing to move before you see the whole picture. God's direction often comes as we go, not before we go. Think about Peter walking on water. As long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, he did the impossible. But the moment he started looking around, trying to understand how it was happening, he began to sink. That's what happens when we lean too much on our own understanding. When we start analyzing, overthinking, and trying to figure it all out, we lose sight of the one who called us. We sink into fear, into doubt, into hesitation. But if we keep our eyes on Jesus, if we trust him even when it doesn't make sense, we'll walk on what should have drowned us. Maybe God is asking you to step into something new. Maybe he's calling you to start that business, to go back to school, to take a position that stretches you, but fear is holding you back. You're saying, what if I fail? What if I'm not ready? What if I heard wrong? But what if instead of thinking of all the ways it could go wrong, you started believing for all the ways it could go right? What if you trusted that if God called you, he has already made a way? So often we let uncertainty stop us. We think if I don't know exactly how it's going to work, I won't move. But what if Noah had said that? What if he had told God, I'll build the ark, but first show me the rain? He would have missed his destiny. What if David had said, I'll fight Goliath, but only if you tell me exactly how this will play out? He would have missed his victory. Trust means stepping forward even when you don't see the full picture. God never promised we would understand everything. He never said, I'll give you all the details up front. No, he said, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. That means there will be times when you don't see the way, when it doesn't add up, when it feels impossible. But that's when trust is activated. That's when faith takes over. Maybe right now, you're in a season where nothing makes sense. You feel like God has placed a dream in your heart, but everything around you seems to be going in the opposite direction. You're asking God, how does this fit into your plan? Why is this taking so long? Why do I feel stuck? But let me remind you, just because you don't understand doesn't mean God isn't working. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean he isn't moving. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean he isn't moving. God's ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. That means sometimes what looks like a setback is really a setup. What feels like a delay is actually divine preparation. What seems like confusion is just God working behind the scenes, aligning the right people, the right opportunities, and the right timing. If you could see everything God is doing, you wouldn't doubt. If you knew how he was going to bring it all together, you wouldn't be anxious. But that's why he calls us to trust. That's why he asks us to believe before we see, to step before we understand, to move forward even when we don't have all the answers. So today, make the decision, God, I don't have to understand everything to trust you. I don't have to see the whole staircase to take the first step. I choose to believe that if you called me, you will make a way. When you live like that, when you trust in God more than you trust in your own understanding, you will step into blessings you never imagined. You will walk in favor, in divine opportunities, in supernatural breakthroughs. Doors will open that no man can shut. The right connections will come at the right time, and you will look back and say, I didn't understand it then, but now I see God was working all along. So don't let the need for full understanding keep you from moving forward. Trust him. Step out in faith and watch how God turns every unknown into a testimony of his goodness. Your past does not disqualify you. Too many people let their history hold them back from their destiny. They think, I've made too many mistakes. I've failed too many times. I've gone too far in the wrong direction. But let me remind you today, God does not call the perfect. He calls the willing. He doesn't look at your past to determine your future. When he calls you, he already knows everything about you, the good, the bad, and the broken parts. And he still says, you are chosen, you are called, you are mine. Maybe you've been carrying guilt over past decisions. Maybe you've been replaying your failures, thinking they have disqualified you from God's plan. But hear this, nothing in your past is stronger than God's grace. No mistake is beyond his redemption. No failure is big enough to cancel his calling on your life. When he called Moses, Moses had a past. He had made mistakes. He had run away. He had disqualified himself in his own mind. But God still said, I have chosen you to lead my people. When God called David, David wasn't perfect. He made serious mistakes. He failed. He fell short. But God still called him a man after my own heart. When Jesus called Peter, Peter was impulsive. He made mistakes. He even denied Jesus at one point. But God didn't cancel Peter's calling because of his failure. In fact, Jesus restored him and used him to build the church. That's the kind of God we serve. He doesn't call those who have it all together. He doesn't look for the most qualified, the most impressive, or the most perfect. No, he looks for those who will say, God, I'm not perfect, but I'm available. I have a past, but I trust your grace is greater. I've made mistakes, but I believe you can still use me. Maybe you've been telling yourself, I missed my chance. I've made too many wrong turns. I should have done things differently. But let me tell you today, God is not finished with you. What he spoke over your life is still true. What he planned for you has not changed. He is not looking at where you've been. He is looking at where he's taking you. Think about the prodigal son. He made bad choices. He walked away from his father's house, wasted his inheritance, and ended up in a place of shame and regret. He thought he had lost his identity, that he had ruined his future. But when he finally turned back, when he came home, the father ran to meet him, embraced him, and restored him. He didn't scold him. He didn't say, I told you so. He didn't remind him of his mistakes. No, he put a robe on his back, a ring on his finger, and welcomed him back as a son. That's the heart of God. No matter how far you've gone, no matter what's in your past, the moment you turn back to him, he restores you. He doesn't see your mistakes. He sees your destiny. He doesn't define you by your failures. He defines you by his love. Some of you have been holding yourself back because of shame. You've been believing the lie that you're not worthy, that you're not good enough, that God can't use someone with your past. But today, I want you to hear this loud and clear. God has already forgiven you. He has already covered your past with his grace. Stop letting what's behind you keep you from stepping into what's ahead of you. When God sees you, he doesn't see your past mistakes. He sees the purpose he put inside you. He doesn't see your failures. He sees your future. You are not who you used to be. You are not defined by what you've done. The Bible says if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has gone, the new is here. That means your past is not just forgiven, it's erased. It's no longer attached to you. Maybe you've been thinking, but I've messed up too much. Let me remind you, God is in the business of redemption. He takes what was broken and makes it whole. He takes what was lost and restores it. He takes what was meant for harm and turns it for good. If you've fallen, get back up. If you've made mistakes, receive his grace. If you've doubted yourself, start believing again, because nothing you have done can stop what God is about to do in your life. So don't let shame hold you back. Don't let regret keep you stuck. Don't let the enemy tell you that your past is greater than your future. God says, I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you hope in a future. That means your best days are not behind you. They're ahead of you. The calling on your life is still active. The purpose God put inside you is still in motion. The only thing you have to do is believe it, receive it, and walk in it. If you've been feeling unqualified, if you've been thinking your past is too messy for God to use, I want you to make this declaration. God, I trust you. I trust that your grace is bigger than my past. I trust that you can still use me. I trust that my best days are ahead of me. When you walk with that kind of faith, when you stop looking at where you've been and start looking at where God is taking you, nothing can stop you from stepping into the purpose he has prepared for you. No more holding back, no more disqualifying yourself, no more believing the lie that your mistakes are too big. Today is the day to step into your calling, to embrace God's grace, and to move forward in confidence, because your past does not disqualify you, it prepares you. And if God called you, he has already made a way for you. God equips those he calls. When he places a dream in your heart, a purpose on your life, he doesn't leave you to figure it out on your own. He doesn't expect you to have all the answers or the skills right away. No, he equips you for what he has called you to do. The problem is, too many of us look at our own abilities, our own resources, and think, I'm not ready. I don't have what it takes. I'm not qualified. But let me remind you, God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. Think about Moses. When God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses immediately started listing reasons why he wasn't the right person. He said, God, I'm not a good speaker. I don't have the confidence. No one will listen to me. But God didn't say, Moses, you're right. Let me find someone else. No. He said, who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them speak or remain silent? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will be with you and teach you what to say. That's how God works. He doesn't look at your limitations. He looks at his power working through you. He doesn't see what you lack. He sees what he has already placed inside you. Maybe you feel unqualified for what God is calling you to do. Maybe you feel like you don't have the experience, the education, or the connections, but God is saying, I will be with you. I will equip you. I will give you everything you need. Look at Gideon. When God called him to lead Israel into battle, Gideon was hiding. He saw himself as the weakest, the least, the most unqualified. But God called him a mighty warrior before he had ever stepped onto the battlefield. That tells me something. God sees you not as you are, but as he created you to be. He sees the potential, the strength, the gifts that are already inside you. And when he calls you, he has already given you what you need to succeed. Sometimes we don't feel equipped because we're looking at the wrong things. We compare ourselves to others. We focus on our weaknesses and we think, I don't measure up. But when God called David to be king, he wasn't the tallest, the strongest, or the most experienced. In fact, his own family overlooked him. They didn't even consider him an option. But God told Samuel, man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. What does that mean for you? It means you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to be the most talented, the most educated, the most experienced. If God called you, he has already placed everything you need inside of you. You may not see it yet, but it's there. You may not feel ready, but God knows you are. He has already gone before you, prepared the way, and set everything in motion for your success. But here's the key. You have to step out in faith. You have to trust that God will equip you as you go. The provision doesn't always come before the step. Sometimes it comes as you step. When the Israelites were crossing the Jordan River, God didn't part the waters first. He told the priests to step in, and as soon as their feet touched the water, the river stopped flowing. What does that tell us? The miracle happens when we move in faith. The equipping comes when we trust that God is with us. Maybe you've been waiting to feel ready. Maybe you've been waiting for everything to be perfect before you take that step. But let me tell you, if you're waiting to feel fully equipped, you'll never move. Because faith isn't about waiting until you have everything. It's about trusting that God will provide as you go. It's about saying, God, I don't see how, but I believe you are making a way. Look at the disciples. Jesus didn't pick the most qualified people. He didn't choose religious scholars or experienced leaders. He chose fishermen, tax collectors, ordinary people. And when he sent them out, they didn't have degrees or years of training, but they had one thing that mattered. They had his presence, and that was enough. You have his presence. You have his spirit inside of you. That means you have wisdom. You have strength. You have everything you need to walk in your calling. You don't have to do it in your own ability. You just have to be available. So what is it that God is calling you to do? What dream has he placed in your heart that seems too big? What opportunity have you been hesitating on because you feel unqualified? Today, I want to challenge you. Stop looking at what you lack and start looking at what you have. Start looking at the God who called you, the God who equips you, the God who goes before you and prepares the way. If he called you, he will strengthen you. If he gave you the vision, he will give you the provision. If he placed that dream in your heart, he will bring the right people, the right doors, the right opportunities. But you have to take that step. You have to say, God, I trust you. I may not feel ready, but I know you are with me. I may not see the way, but I believe you are making one. When you have that kind of faith, you'll see God do things you never imagined. You'll walk in favor. You'll see supernatural provision. You'll step into opportunities that don't make sense because God doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called. And he has already given you everything you need to step into the purpose he has for your life. So don't wait until you feel ready. Don't hold back because you don't have all the answers. Step out in faith, move forward with confidence, and watch how God equips you every step of the way. Obedience leads to blessings. When God calls you, he isn't just giving you an opportunity. He's setting you up for something greater than you can imagine. But the key to unlocking that blessing is obedience. Too often we want to see the reward before we take the step. We say, God, if you show me how this will work out, then I'll obey. If you guarantee success, then I'll move. But that's not how God works. His blessings follow obedience, not the other way around. You have to trust him enough to say yes before you see the outcome. Think about Abraham. God told him to leave his home, his family, everything he had ever known, and go to a land that God would show him. Not a land he could see, not a land he had a map for, but a land God would reveal as he walked. Abraham had to leave before he knew where he was going. That took faith. But because he obeyed, God made him the father of many nations. Some of you are waiting for all the details before you obey. You're saying, God, give me the whole plan first. But if God gave you every detail up front, you wouldn't need faith. He calls us to trust him step by step. Your job is obedience. His job is the outcome. Look at Peter. When Jesus told him to cast his net on the other side of the boat, Peter had every reason to doubt. He had been fishing all night and caught nothing. He was a professional fisherman. He knew the waters. But instead of arguing, he said, nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net. And when he obeyed, he caught so many fish that his nets began to break. The blessing came because of his obedience. Maybe God is asking you to do something that doesn't make sense. Maybe he's calling you to step into something that feels too big, too uncertain, too uncomfortable. But hear this, God never asks you for obedience without a purpose. There is always a blessing on the other side of your yes. Think about Joshua and the Israelites. When they came to Jericho, God gave them an unusual instruction. March around the city for 7 days, and on the seventh day, shout. Now, that didn't make sense in the natural. They weren't using weapons. They weren't attacking the city, but they obeyed. And on the seventh day, the walls came down. Their breakthrough wasn't in their strength. It was in their obedience. Sometimes the instructions God gives you won't make sense. Sometimes he will ask you to take a step that feels risky. Maybe he's asking you to start a business, to take a new job, to walk away from something comfortable. And you're thinking, but God, I don't see how this will work. That's where trust comes in. If you wait until it makes sense, you'll never move. But if you trust God and obey, you'll see doors open that you never expected. Delayed obedience is still disobedience. Some people hear God's calling but keep putting it off. They say, I'll do it when I feel ready. I'll obey when I have more time, more money, more confirmation. But partial obedience is not obedience. If God has told you to step out, if he has placed something on your heart, don't wait, move. Your destiny is on the other side of your obedience. Think about Jonah. God told him to go to Nineveh, but Jonah ran in the opposite direction. He didn't want to obey because it was uncomfortable, but his disobedience led to a storm. It wasn't until he finally surrendered and obeyed that he stepped into his purpose. Sometimes the struggles we face are not because of the enemy. They're because we haven't obeyed what God already told us to do. We're praying for new direction, but God is saying, I already gave you the last instruction. Obey that first. When you walk in obedience, things start to shift. Doors open, favor is released, provision comes. God blesses obedience even in the little things. Maybe he's asking you to forgive someone, to step out in faith, to be a blessing to someone else. You might think it's small, but your obedience in the small things prepares you for the big things. David was faithful in the field before he was ever anointed king. He took care of sheep. He obeyed in obscurity, and that obedience positioned him for promotion. What if your next breakthrough is tied to your obedience? What if the opportunity you're praying for is waiting on your yes? God has already lined up the right people, the right doors, the right resources, but you have to take the step. So today, make the decision to obey. Don't wait until you understand it all. Don't wait until you feel ready. Trust that if God is calling you to it, he has already gone before you. He has already prepared the way. And when you say yes, when you step out in faith, you will walk into blessings you never imagined. Obedience leads to favor. Obedience opens doors. Obedience positions you for the miraculous. So hesitate. Say yes to God and watch how he moves in your life.